No, we'll a couple of minutes in, so I think we'll get started. Good evening, everyone, as always. So I'd like very much to try and finish the sugya today, hence forgive me for not delaying. If we just look at the Mishnah again, Hatokiv to Kifa Achas. So this is Mishnah in Kalayim, Perik Tes Halak Mishnah Yud, and on page 1 of the source sheet. The Mishnah says that one is Tokiv to Kifa Achas, Ein Chibur Ve'ein Ba Mishnah Kalayim, and Hushman Tob Shabbos Pata. Also, Shnei Roshel Sadechod Chibur V'yesh Ba Mishnah Kalayim, Hushman Tob Shabbos Chayv. So the Rosh equates Kalayim, or what we would call sharpness, and Shabbos. And he therefore understands that Tekifa Achas is synonymous with Tefira Achas. As Edwards was just saying, Tefira Achas, even though it's loosely translated as one stitch, doesn't really mean that. It really means one thrust, one insertion of the needle and thread through the cloth. And therefore one cloth pull through, even if one then knots both ends, is pata, both with respect to Shabbos and with respect to sharpness. Whereas if one does two ins and outs, what in Hebrew we'd call shtei tfiras, but in English that would mean a double stitch rather than a single stitch, then one is chayiv. So the Rosh, Rabbi Shimshon, equates the two and adds in therefore to the Mishnah that it must be talking about a case where one knotted both ends, and therefore both conditions are fulfilled. And this is the crucial point. There's really two separate halachas here which are relevant. Halacha number 1 is shtei tefiras, which is mentioned in our Mishnah, and is a halacha in Shabbos, and the Rosh understands is the identical halacha with sharpness. And the second halacha, which is not the Mishnah but the Gemara, is that one needs a knot in order to ensure that it's miskayemes. And if you're lacking either, then according to the Rosh, one is exempt from sharpness and exempt from Shabbos. So again, if, for example, and Gary texted me off group about this, if, for example, you have a single stitch, what in Hebrew is called a tefira achas, meaning the thread just goes through once, even though one has knotted both sides such that it is miskayemes, I mean, it will hold tight, nonetheless, it is lacking something in not being shtei tefiras, and therefore, according to the Rosh, both with respect to Shabbos and with respect to sharpness, it is insufficient to make you chayiv. So this is what the Mishnah says according to the Rosh. And Gary, I saw you wanted to say something, but does that answer your question? Or?
No, but I can wait. When you say a double stitch,
yes,
what do you mean by that?
So again, to clarify, in Lashon HaKodesh, in Mishnaic Hebrew, Tefira that we're referring to refers to going once through the cloth. You take the thread and the needle and you go through both cloths. The double tefira is where you go in and out. So you have a full, what we in English would call a stitch.
Okay, I thought, that sounds grand, a double stitch in English is when you do two stitches that go through this almost the same pair of holes.
Okay, so I'm misusing my English then. I simply meant an in and out stitch as opposed to just.
That was fine. I'm just saying that I wasn't sure what you meant.
No,
sorry.
I'm clarifying that because I'm evidently not speaking clearly then. So a tefira, a single tefira is one direction. Double tefira is an in and out, what we would call a single stitch, effectively. So this is the
is two tekifot or two tefira.
That's right. That's how the Rosh understands it. Tzad means that you've ended up with the thread out on the same side, or you've been in and out. That's how the Rosh understands it. So the Rosh understands sharpness and Shabbos to have the same halachas. And in addition, we've pointed out there are two halachas here. One is kiyum, for which you need a knot, the Gemara says. And the other one is, though we were medayik, that if you have 3 stitches, maybe you don't need knotting for kiyum, and that's reasonable. And the other halacha is a shear or something about needing 2 tefiras. What's the logic of needing 2 tefiras? So that was our chakira, that was our original inquiry. Either it's a shear, like there are shiurim with many melachas, and many other areas of halacha too, for that matter. Meaning to say, if you have half a gazais, it's still, you've eaten something, but you haven't eaten enough to do the mitzvah or to be chayiv for the averah. Similarly with Shabbos, there's a measure of what you need, and that would be a good reading of the halacha, though it would be strange that the Mishnah lists this share and doesn't list other shiurim. The alternative way of reading the Mishnah is that the Mishnah is saying you're only chayiv for tefira, which has a shtei tefiras, because only then is it a true stitch. If it's just one way, one directional, then this isn't a true stitch. But for now, that we're leaving unresolved, and to a degree, I'm not going to be able to resolve it at all. We then get to the Rambam, who says
one thing, Rabbi Zobin, is the Mishnah does have three other examples of stating two. It states two letters and two weavings.
yes.
So it's not the only example in the Mishnah. There's three examples of two given as a shiur.
Correct.
So it's not completely in isolation.
It doesn't resolve the question, because Hagufa, with each of those melachos, will need to understand why those are singled out. Meaning the same premise might apply to the others also, that this is somehow more definitional about what the melacha is than just a shiur. Because the truth is, all of the 39 melachos have a shiur. So if the Mishnah is just listing shiurim, it should list all 39. It selects only 3 examples of shiurim, of the quantity of mentioning 2. Either that's because for some reason those are the cases where it mentions the shiur, or because this isn't a shiur, it's not just a quantity, but somehow the quantity defines the quality. And without that, it isn't the essence of the melacha itself. And there's a potential nafkamina, by the way, around this, which is normally we know that chatzi shiur is asur min haTorah, or asur min rabbanon, but chatzi shiur is certainly asur, meaning to say if you do the melacha but you just lack a shiur, it would still be potter of an asur. Whereas if this isn't a shiur, but the definition of the melacha, then you could contemplate the possibility that it would be mutter, it would be completely allowed, because I simply haven't done the melacha if I don't do the shiur. So this is the Rush. The Rambam takes a different viewpoint, and the Rambam understands the Mishnah to mean something else. The Mishnah is talking about one of 2 options to tell you your chayav for sharpness, either one directional, not in and out, or 2 directional, in and out, without a knot. In brief, we're not learning Hilchos sharpness over here, we're learning Hilchos Shabbos, but the Rambam understands that with respect to sharpness, a far lower threshold needs to occur in order to make you chayiv for sharpness. And we saw the Mefarshim, both the Mefarshim and the Rambam, and the Nosei Kelim on the Shulchan Aruch, the Taz, the Vilna Gaon, all answer more or less in one direction, that with sharpness, even if it's lacking permanence, and even if it's lacking 2 stitches, nonetheless, they are joined. And as long as it's joined, that's enough. It's with Shabbos uniquely that there's this specific requirement of needing kiyum and needing 2 stitches. Now, kiyum, we've discussed previously, and that I understand is a unique halacha in Hilchos Shabbos. With Hilchos Shabbos, you need a significance to the melacha, that it should have a degree of permanence, whereas with sharpness, there's no such specification. And that's almost mefurish in the Vilna Gaon and the Taz that we mentioned, that's a unique halacha in melacha, according to the Rambam, and not relevant to sharpness. However, why is there a difference with respect to needing 2 stitches or 1? I mean, if only 2 stitches is a join, then that should apply to sharpness. And if less than 2 stitches, even 1 in is enough of a join, then why isn't that enough with respect to Shabbos? Now, we may be tempted to answer that this is because with Shabbos you need tefira, you need a stitch, whereas with sharpness you just need a join, and therefore anything is a join. However, this would appear, and this is where we left off last year, this would appear to be incorrect, because the Rambam tells us in Perek Yud Halacha Yud Aleph that medabek, sticking pieces of paper together, is also the melacha. Now, with dibuk, there's no tefira, there's no stitching, and therefore the lomdus of needing the shiur can't be to do with a stitch, because there is no stitch. It must be a svara in the amount of melacha I need to do, and therefore this would apply to sticking as much as stitching. So what we are concluding at this point is that the logic of shtei tefiras is a measure. You need a certain minimal quantity of joining in order for it to be significant as a melacha. So this is another halacha in significance as a melacha. The shiur, the amount of joining I need to do for it to be meaningful for Shabbos. With shortness, any joining is enough, even though it's really, if you have 1 thread, it's just joined by a pinprick width, just the width of the thread is the amount that it's joined. Nonetheless, that's sufficient for sharpness. However, with respect to Shabbos, you need a minimal measure for it to have some sort of significance and chashivas, and that minimal measure is the size of a stitch, even with medabek, where there is no stitching. So this is what I sort of, where I left things last year. And I simply alluded to the fact, and I think perhaps Gary mentioned this, that there is a potential flaw in the reasoning. because actually I made a leap here, and I assumed that the shear which applied to stitching should also apply to sticking. And this isn't necessarily correct. And indeed, the Rambam doesn't really mention a shear with respect to sticking. And the rationale behind that would be because sticking is a tolda of Tofer. And we've already seen the view of the Rambam, particularly as expressed by his son, Rabbi Zobin ben Rambam, in answer and explaining the view of the Rambam, is that Avos and toldas are different melachos. They don't necessarily have cross-transferable rules. A rule that's said by an Av need not apply to a tolda. Now, if you understand a tolda just to be like a subcategory or sub-example of the Av, that doesn't make any sense. But if you understand that a tolda is a different melacha, it's its own melacha, it's just categorized under the broad heading of the Avos, is that sort of class or family of melachas, but it's not synonymous, it's not identical, it's not just another way of doing the same melacha. If it was another way of doing the same melacha, it would be a ko-av. The definition of it being a tolda is it's a different melacha. Therefore, it doesn't necessarily have the same dinim. And we saw this in the Rambam, who classifies, for example, both oifer and mavashal, baking and boiling or cooking, as ko-avos. And only if it's something that's very different would it be a tolda. So we saw this, for example, in cholev, milking, which is a tolda of soichet, whilst Tosfos, for example, assumes that all the rules of soichet, squeezing, should apply to cholev, because that's what it means if it says cholev, milking is a tolda of soichet, which in turn is a type of dosh, of threshing. It means removing the oichel from the cow is just another similar example to removing the fruit from its husk, or squeezing juice out of a fruit. They're all just examples in a sense of each other, and therefore the halacha should be cross-transferable. The Rambam disagreed. And the Rambam said just because there's a halacha with dosh and soichet, that it's only with gedulei karka, things that grow in the grounds, with cholev, no, cholev is a different melacha, it's milking, it's its own melacha. In the words of the Gemara later, cholev mishum cholev, cholev is chayv because it's cholev, it's its own melacha. It just happens to be a tolda of soichet. And therefore the Rambam, we could say, would learn that medabek, that gluing and sticking, is a tolda and doesn't have this shear. So this
Sorry,
is
can I just ask?
the second point I wanted to say. Yeah.
I'm a bit confused about this point that you're making, because I thought we were saying in the understanding of the Rambam, the whole point is that you have chibur plus a kiyum, right? So his chibur is the same for kalayim and across all of Torah, perhaps. Plus is the kiyum on top. So the Shiur doesn't come into it at all. So I understand the point that you're saying, that you don't want to because of the Rabbi Zobin ben Rambam Svara, you don't want to transfer Tolda. But is that even a relevant point here? Because in the Tolda case or the gluing case, you also have a chibur plus a kiyum. There's no element of Shiur, so I'm a bit confused.
Okay, so what your starting premise is not entirely correct. The Rambam says that sharpness is different to melachot Shabbos in two respects, not one respect. One difference is that sharpness doesn't need kiyum and a melachot does need a kiyum. But the second difference is that Shabbos needs a shear of shtei tefillos and kalayim, sharpness doesn't need 2 stitches. So now we are pondering, why is it that Shabbos needs 2 shtei tefillos, an in and an out, and sharpness only needs 1? And the potential answer is because sharpness, it's enough that you're just joining. Shabbos, you need a tefillah. We then wonder, but that's not quite true, because at least in the Tolda world, even a joining and a chibur that isn't a stitching is enough, like gluing. So now we are left unclear. Does gluing also need the shear of shtei tefillos? Because it's, in that respect, has the same measure as Tofer. It needs a significant length to be joined. Or no, it's its own Tolda, and therefore it doesn't have the shear of shtei tefillos. But one thing is for sure, at least when it comes to stitching, forget gluing, but when it comes to stitching, the Rambam is explicit that for Shabbos you need shtei tefillos, and that's not a chiddush, that's a Mishnah. The Rambam's simply quoting the Mishnah, whereas with sharpness, he learns you don't need shtei tefillos. So that bit at least is clear, that with respect to sharpness, the joining is enough without a measure, whereas with Shabbos, at least for Tofer, you need a measure. For gluing, we're not sure what the Rambam would say about the measure or not.
Well, how can you have a measure with gluing? I don't understand how it's even relevant.
Well, you can glue a pinprick or you can glue a certain length. And it's possible that the minimum length of gluing that would be significant would be equivalent to 1 stitch, to a double stitch, sorry, to an in and out stitch.
So it's all about the length.
Yeah.
How do you see that the Rambam, when he says you explicitly need tefillot, is understanding it to be a quantitative shear? I think that's the point where I'm not following.
We don't know anything, but let's reason and think. The Rambam says that when it comes to Tofer, you need shtei tefillos. That's a fact. That's a Mishnah. So why do you need shtei tefillos? Well, who knows? If the reason you need shtei tefillos is because without it, it's not a significant joining, and that's a general rule in Kol HaTorah Kula, then the same would apply with Sharnas. And the Rambam learns that with Sharnas, you don't need that amount. So we've resolved part of our inquiry. Clearly, this is a unique Shabbos halacha. Now, is it unique Shabbos halacha with respect to joining, or unique Shabbos halacha with respect to tefillah? So initially, I assumed it's unique Shabbos halacha with respect to everything, because they're all one melacha. That's not quite correct, because it could be it's a unique halacha with respect to the significance of sewing, but not a unique halacha with respect to the significance of chibur, of just gluing and joining. So this is the maths of where I've got to. I then discovered two things. Number one, what I've just said is a machlokas achronim. And the second point is, I think, to my disappointment, I've made yet again an error. And I will now share with you my mea culpa here and explain why I think this is a mistake. So first of all, this is a fact. The Biur Halacha assumes that with gluing, you need the shear of shtei tefillos in the same way as you need the measure of shtei tefillos with respect to stitching. And that's in the Biur Halacha that I printed. The Minchas Chinuch, on the other hand, learns that the measure of shtei tefillos is applicable to the Av of Tofer, but not to the Tolda of Medabik. Again, a fact. That's what the Minchas Chinuch says. That's a summary of those two sources. So at this point, great. We know that we've been on a healthy journey. We've retraced the path of these two wonderful achronim. The Mishnah Berurah, the Chafetz Chaim, says like our one possibility, that no, the shear of shtei tefillos applies across the board. It's a length in the melacha. A melacha has to have a significance. A pinprick join isn't enough. It has to be a stitch length join, whether with respect to literally stitching or whether with respect to gluing. And the Minchas Chinuch says no, it's possible that the Av of Tofer needs a stitch length in and out, and the Tolda of Medabik doesn't need a shear. And as we've explained, as the Rabbizobin and Rambam says, and as Gary reminded us on Sunday, because it's possible that you have the shear for one and not for the other. One is an Av, one is a Tolda. So far, we are in the company of the greats. However, I am now left wondering, having thought through this again, and I don't understand one of my tzedadim, and as a result, I don't understand one of these achronim, I don't understand the Minchas Chinuch. Because everything we have said is impeccable logic. There's no mistake in this. Other than a practical question, which is what happens if I do a single stitch, not the in and out stitch? Good. We know the answer to that question. I cannot be chayav for the Av of Tofer because the Av of Tofer needs an in and an out. But if joining through glue is even a chiyuv as the Tolda for a pinprick join, even though it doesn't go in, it's not the equivalent of the length of in and out, then why shouldn't every single stitch be chayav for the Tolda, for the joining through some other method? There's no unique halacha in the Tolda, it has to be glue. If I use a thread tightly knotted on either side to join it, albeit only a pinprick because it's not going in and out, were it to be the case that the Tolda was chayav for that, I should always be chayav for that. In other words, what distinguishes the Tolda from the Av to mean that I'm not chayav in the Tolda scenario for the Tolda in a case where I just do a single stitch? And therefore, I better understand the Mishnah Berurah, who therefore assumed that the Tolda of gluing would also need the measure of a stitch in and out, because otherwise, otherwise you should always be chayav for a single stitch because it's no worse than gluing. So I think this demonstrates. Yes,
I was just going to ask. The Minchas Chinuch does say though, the Bekoshen chayav im hu mitkayam. You're only chayav still if you're mitkayam. So there is a qualification. Whilst it's a kol shehu, it's only a kol shehu if it's mitkayam.
That is correct, and that's why I added the single stitch would have to be knotted on both sides. There's two separate halachas over here. Again, there's a halacha of kiyum mentioned in the Gemara, and there's a halacha of length mentioned in the Mishnah of needing shtei tefillos, not tefillah achas. The halacha of kiyum is probably a cross halacha rule. When the Gemara asks for Halomis Kayemes, it's a sort of a general rule that we discussed. Maybe it's unique to Tofer, but it's a concept we find in many melachos. And that certainly for a single stitch, you would need kiyum. The question is now the measure, the length. Do you need an in and out length, only a in length? Now, our logic is correct. There's no proof, seemingly, that you need an in and out length for gluing. The Rambam doesn't mention such a shiur. He only mentions the shiur for stitching. So the Minchas Chinuch is entitled to say that gluing doesn't need this, as we've explained. However, the question is, but then every stitch that's only one in rather than double is a pinprick join. If it's knotted on either side of that stitch, such as it's miskayemes, what's lacking? Why shouldn't it be chayav as a minimal chibur? Why is a single stitch worse than a gluing if it's knotted tightly together? Unless you say some svara that a stitch doesn't join it as well as gluing, and therefore it doesn't. One could leap to the defense of the Minchas Chinuch, but at least at the moment now, I understand better why one would assume that this shiur would apply to both. So this is what I wanted to say on with respect to Korea, Tofer, but I now want to continue and speak about Tofer, and again share a mistake I made in the sugya, which will really open up for us a discussion around Korea, because of course the Mishnah talks about the Mishnah talks about sewing, and it also talks about separating. Now, interestingly, with respect to Shabbos, it only talks about the separation halacha, not the Tofer halacha. So with respect to sharpness, it talks about the attachment and what attachment is needed for sharpness. With respect to Shabbos, it talks about the detachment, hashomta b'Shabbos, chayev or potter. So I missed this subtlety in the language of the Mishnah all through the sugya till I looked at it again and realized that we've been assuming that Korea and Tofer are symmetrical, but actually this isn't entirely obvious at all, and it's possible that they are asymmetrical, that they're not identical with respect to Korea and Tofer. Now, the Rambam in his halachas of Korea, and I printed this in Halacha 6, says, in source 6, the Rambam in Halacha Shabbat, very good Halacha Yud, says, HaKorea kadei litver shtei tefillas, al menas litver shtei tefillas chayev. If one tears kadei litver shtei tefillas and al menas litver shtei tefillas, you're chayev. Now, what do these two clauses mean? So the simplest way of understanding the Rambam is that the Rambam is saying you need two conditions with Korea. You need to tear enough to be the length of 2 stitches, and you need to do it in order to sew 2 stitches. So this brings us into preparation for the sugya of Korea. We already saw in the Mishnah that you're only chayev for Korea if it's al menas litvar, if it's on condition in order to re-sew. Now the Mishnah lists a few al menases, and we'll have to work through them and work out which cases is it conditional or not. For example, with moichik, with erasing, it says al menas lichtov. And I remind you to have a look at Tosfos on Ein Gimel Amud Aleph, in which he talks about what this condition is with melachos, and also to have a look at Tosfos on Ein Gimel Amud Beis, in which Tosfos again talks about this idea in Tosfos de Rasal V'Tzorich. So we will, when we learn Korea, look at what almanas means. Now the Rambam says explicitly that almanas is only chayev, that Korea is only chayev if you tear in order to tear 2 stitches, and to you tear a length of 2 stitches in order to sew 2 stitches. So says the Rambam. Now, what we need though to understand is that nonetheless a cross translation is not necessarily to Tofer is not necessarily correct, because the Mishnah Berurah also says that the Rambam is of the view that you need shtei tefillas, is only when you are tearing in order to resew, because there are tearing in order to resew is a positive melacha as preparation for sewing. Every melacha has to be constructive and not destructive. And what makes korea constructive is that I'm laying the groundwork to sew. I'm tofer, I'm korea al manas litva. In such a scenario, says the Mishnah Berurah, you would have to sew, you would have to tear a length of 2 stitches in order to do enough of a korea so that you are then doing it in order to resew 2 stitches, and you're laying the groundwork for the melach of tofer. And therefore, korea would have the shiur of tofer. However, what happens if I'm doing a different form of constructive korea? And the classic example of this is korea b'chamosoi, when you tear in order to let out negative energy and fury and anger. In that case, the Mishnah Berurah says you wouldn't need a shiur, a measure of 2 stitches. So there are possible distinctions between korea and tofer. We may enter the sugya of korea assuming it's symmetrical to tofer. However, we see the Mishnah in Kilayim only talks about korea, not tofer, and the Mishnah Berurah suggests that the measure of korea that the Rambam says of needing 2 stitches is only where korea is a means to an end, where the point of the korea is in order to resew. However, if the purpose of the korea is in and of in itself, for example, when you're tearing out of to vent frustration, the shiur may not be necessary. Finally, the Mishnah says potter in Hashemta b'Shabbos, which indicates that even if it's 1 stitch or not knotted, it would be potter aval osa, which is interesting. And again, I point out that this is only with korea. We have no proof that this is the same case with tofer. So just to summarize, in the first 25 minutes of shiur, we spoke about tofer. We discussed what the shiur of 2 stitches are. We didn't get to a clear conclusion. Is it the definition of a stitch, or is it just the measure of a chashivos? We then discussed that it would appear to be a Shabbos halacha, because according to the Rambam, it isn't a halacha in shartness, whereas according to Rabbeinu Shimshon, it's halacha in shartness and Shabbos, in which case it would appear to be a logic in stitching, not in Shabbos. But according to the Rambam, it's a unique halacha in Shabbos, and therefore it's something about Shabbos. We suggested maybe it's only a halacha in stitching on Shabbos, not in gluing on Shabbos, and we saw the Mishnah Berurah didn't say like that against the Minchas Chinuch, and the logic seemingly would be because otherwise every time one stitches, one would also be chayav for joining. And then in the last 5 minutes, we spoke about the Mishnah. Notice the Mishnah in Kilayim is only talking about korea, and we saw that the Mishnah says korea is in order to stitch. However, it's not clear if that's the only scenario, or there's other scenarios of korea, such as tearing out of frustration, and possibly the shiur only applies in korea, which is a means to prepare the ground for stitching, as opposed to korea, which is in an end in itself. And this opens up the next sugya, where we'll start learning korea and try and understand what the nature of this melacha is. So that brings to an end tofer, and on Sunday we will start korea. And as I said, one of the things we look at in korea, just to give you a Mara Makom in advance, is the clause and condition in korea that has to be on manas litva, and Tosfos in the Mishnah, and Tosfos on Gimel on base, who discusses what this condition means. So I'll stop there, and I'll stop for good evening.
Can I just ask quickly?
Yes, you can. I've got to go tomorrow, so I've only got about 30 seconds. I apologize.
Okay, that's fine. I'm just still trying to understand it. You said several times that the tofer is about length, but what would that length be? Why are you moving away from the fact that it's on strength? I mean, even on gluing, you can have a stronger glue which on a lesser length. Why have we moved away from, and stitching, you can have a long stitch or a short stitch?
Yeah, I don't know really how to answer that question, other than if the Mishnah Berurah is of the view that tofer is a relevant shiur to gluing also, it must be about a minimal stitch length, the minimal length of a stitch. So it can't be 1 pinprick, it would have to be 2 pinpricks. That's the only way I know to cross-transfer the measure to gluing. There isn't a halacha I'm aware of needing a particular strength thread. So presumably you could have a double twined thread where 1 stitch would be as strong as an in and out with a double length to it. So that's presumably why the Mishnah Berurah is understanding this as a length as opposed to a strength.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm aware that's not an entirely satisfactory answer, but it's the best I have.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I wish everyone a good evening. Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank you as always for joining. Good night.
Thank you.